He forced his slave to impregnate his own wife and stood watching from the shadows as it happened. That horror took root in a quiet plantation home where Bible verses echoed louder than screams. For months, the house seemed hushed but whole, until a storm cracked the estate's old well wide open. Inside, a collar, a child's blanket, and bones chained in place, with scripture tucked in the folds. The truth buried there isn't just murder. It's what the master called God's plan, and what still might be missing from the ledger. If you would like me to continue creating stories so that this history, which is not taught in schools, is not forgotten, please subscribe to this channel. Write in the comments where you are watching from. The weak January sun filtered through the parlor's lace curtains, casting latticed shadows across Eunice Whitfield's crumpled form. She lay beside the mahogany prayer bench, her fingers clutching both her stomach and her morning prayer book, the pages bent beneath her weight. The sweat-soaked fabric of her linen gown clung to her slight frame, darkening from cream to amber where it touched the polished floor. Reverend Josiah Whitfield stood in the doorway, his tall figure blocking the hall light. His silver-touched beard caught the morning glow as he surveyed the scene with an unsettling stillness. After several heartbeats, he called out sharply, "Dinah! Fetch water and send Thomas for Dr. Tulliver." The house stirred to life. Feet shuffled on wooden floors, doors creaked, and whispers filled the corridors. Through the window, past the frost-killed garden, field hands paused in their work, heads turning toward the main house as Thomas's horse thundered down the muddy road toward town. Dr. Ambrose Tulliver arrived within the hour, his medical bag stained with winter mud. The physician's wire-rimmed spectacles fogged in the warmth of the house as Dinah led him to where Eunice now lay on a settee, attended by her anxious husband. Tulliver noted the woman's pallor, her rapid breathing, the way her hands trembled as they rested protectively over her middle. "Leave us," Tulliver instructed, and even Reverend Whitfield withdrew, though he lingered just beyond the parlor door. The examination was brief but thorough. Tulliver's weathered hands moved with professional efficiency, his questions precise and clinical. When he opened his field journal, a well-worn volume bound in stitched calfskin, his pencil scratched across the page with measured strokes. "Mrs. Whitfield appears to be with child," he announced when Josiah was readmitted. "I estimate 3 months along." The Reverend's reaction was curious, a slight stiffening of his spine, a tightening around his eyes, though his lips curved into what might have been a smile. "The Lord's reward," he declared, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of his Sunday sermons. "After 15 years of patience." Through the partly open door, Tulliver glimpsed movement, house servants passing in the hall, their faces carefully blank. Among them was Elijah, the tall Georgian bondsman, his eyes downcast as he carried firewood past the parlor. Something in his posture, a certain tension in his shoulders, caught the doctor's attention. As Tulliver packed his instruments, he overheard fragments of whispered conversations from the kitchen quarter. Called to the house again, after sunset. The master's private theology lessons. Each comment died away when the speakers noticed his presence. The winter day was already fading when Tulliver finally mounted his horse. Lantern light from the kitchen windows cast long shadows across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the gathering dusk. As he adjusted his bag, Dinah emerged from the servants' entrance, a shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. "Doctor," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the frozen ground. "She don't cry no more in the nights." Tulliver studied her face for a long moment before nodding once. Back in his saddle, he withdrew his field journal, and, by the light of his own lantern, made a careful note to contact the county coroner. The winter dusk settled early over the Whitfield estate, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that sent most of the field hands hurrying toward the warmth of the quarters. Clem, however, lingered behind, gathering dropped cotton bolls that had escaped the day's picking. His weathered hands moved mechanically through the fading light, though his attention kept drifting to the old mule barn at the edge of the property. Lantern light flickered through the barn's warped boards, casting strange shadows across the frost-hardened ground. As Clem drew closer, voices carried on the still evening air. He recognized Elijah's deep timbre, usually so steady, now trembling slightly as he recited, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness." A pause, then a stumble over the words. "According unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions." Again. Reverend Whitfield's voice cut through the darkness, sharp as a blade. "From the beginning, your emphasis is wrong." Clem edged closer to the barn wall, his cotton sack forgotten in his hands. Through a gap in the planks, he glimpsed Elijah kneeling on the packed earth floor, hands bound before him with rough rope. The Reverend stood over him, Bible open, his silver-touched beard catching the lantern light as he bent down. "Have mercy upon me, O God," Elijah began again, his voice hoarse. "Louder," Whitfield commanded. "Let the Lord hear your repentance." The next morning, Dr. Tulliver made his weekly rounds through the quarters, checking on winter coughs and chilblains. Dinah found him as he packed his bag, her dark eyes darting toward the main house before she spoke. "It ain't right. What's happening in that barn?" she whispered. Drawing back her sleeve, she revealed rope burns on her wrist. "These ain't mine. I tend to him after, when the Reverend's done with his teaching." Tulliver's jaw tightened. He'd seen similar marks on Elijah's wrists during brief encounters, but the man always pulled his sleeves down and turned away. "How often?" "3 times this week alone. He comes back different each time, quieter." Dinah's voice cracked. "Neighbors been noticing too. Miss Sarah from the Mitchell place asked if Elijah was sick, way he's drawing into himself." That afternoon, Tulliver rode to Hayneville and composed an urgent telegram to the county coroner. The operator, Jim Watts, assured him it would go out immediately. But 3 days later, Tulliver discovered the message had never arrived. "Most peculiar thing," Watts explained, shifting nervously behind his desk. Reverend Whitfield himself stopped by that very evening. Said he was handling all county business personally now. The operator's eyes flickered to a heavy envelope protruding from his drawer. The following Sunday, smoke curled from the Whitfield estate's chapel chimney as the congregation gathered for service. Eunice sat in the front pew, hands folded over her growing belly, while Elijah stood at the back, required to attend, but kept separate. Reverend Whitfield took the pulpit, his frock coat immaculate, Bible open before him. His voice filled the small space as he read. "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair." His gaze, sharp and hungry, fixed on Elijah as he spoke the words. Thunder cracked across the Lowndes County sky as rain lashed against the windows of the Whitfield estate. Inside the master bedroom, kerosene lanterns cast wavering shadows, while 2 local midwives worked frantically over Eunice's thrashing form. Her screams pierced through the storm's fury, drawing worried glances from the house servants gathered in the hallway below. "She's bleeding too much," Martha, the elder midwife, muttered as she pressed clean linens against Eunice's pale thighs. "Get more hot water," she ordered her assistant, who hurried from the room with a copper basin. Reverend Whitfield paced outside the door, his Bible clutched tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Each time Eunice cried out, he would pause, then resume his measured steps, lips moving in silent prayer. Near midnight, beneath a particularly violent crack of lightning, Eunice delivered. The child emerged silent and still, its tiny form limp in Martha's weathered hands. "Too early," she whispered, wrapping the infant in a length of white church linen. "I'm sorry, Reverend." Whitfield snatched the bundled child before anyone could examine it closely. "Leave us," he commanded, voice tight with barely contained fury. "All of you. Out." The midwives gathered their bloodied cloths and hurried away, crossing themselves as they descended the stairs. Through the driving rain, Whitfield carried the wrapped bundle himself to the far corner of the property. No one witnessed the burial. Even the field hands stayed in their quarters, doors barred against the storm's wrath. Dawn broke grey and heavy with lingering clouds. Dr. Tulliver's buggy appeared on the main road, wheels cutting through mud as he responded to an anonymous message about complications at the Whitfield estate. He found Eunice unconscious, pale as paper, while Reverend Whitfield blocked the doorway to her chamber. "I must examine the child's remains," Tulliver insisted, setting his medical bag down firmly. "There's nothing to examine. It's done. As county physician, I have a duty." "Show him," Eunice's weak voice interrupted from within. "Let him see what God has wrought." Whitfield's jaw clenched, but he led Tulliver to the fresh-turned earth. The doctor insisted on exhuming the tiny bundle, noting the Methodist church markings on the burial linen as he carefully unwrapped the child's face. In his leather-bound journal, Tulliver's steady hand recorded, "Male infant, approximately 7 months term. Significant melanation inconsistent with Anglo heritage. No signs of violence, though premature birth apparent cause of death." "You will record nothing," Whitfield growled, looming over Tulliver's shoulder. "Breathe a word of this, and I'll see you ruined for libel. No decent family in 3 counties will allow you near their door." Later that afternoon, as Tulliver gathered his supplies to leave, Dinah caught his sleeve in the kitchen. Her voice barely carried above a whisper. "I seen him, Doctor. Seen Elijah walking out that room more than once. White lady's tears on his shirt." When night fell again, the slave quarters buzzed with worried whispers. Elijah's pallet lay empty. The next morning, Reverend Whitfield stood before the county clerk in Hayneville, presenting a bill of sale with flourished handwriting. "Sold to a gentleman in Natchez," he explained smoothly. "Fair price for a trained field hand." The clerk, Mr. Henderson, held the paper closer to his window light. The ink glistened wetly on the page, though the date clearly read April 30th. He glanced up at Whitfield's impassive face, then carefully pressed the official seal against the document. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Whitfield estate as Sheriff Otis Pell guided his horse through the iron gates. His pocket watch showed 9:30, though the heavy air already promised another sweltering May day. Dr. Tulliver's urgent message had brought him here, despite his reservations about disturbing a man of Reverend Whitfield's standing. The main house rose before him, its white columns gleaming like bleached bones. As Pell dismounted, he noticed a pale face in an upstairs window, Eunice Whitfield, still as a portrait, staring at nothing. "Sheriff Pell!" Reverend Whitfield's voice boomed from the front porch. "What brings you out on such a fine morning?" He descended the steps, Bible tucked under one arm, wearing his customary black coat despite the heat. "Routine matters, Reverend. Thought I'd check in after the recent difficulties." Pell removed his hat, noting how the surrounding fields stood silent. No songs from the cotton rows, no children playing between the cabins. Even the chickens seemed subdued. "Come into the cool," Whitfield gestured toward the house. "I've just opened a bottle of peach wine, a gift from my sister's orchard." The parlour smelled of beeswax and leather-bound books. Whitfield poured 2 crystal glasses while launching into a discourse on Matthew's Gospel. Pell sipped politely, letting the preacher's words wash over him as he studied the room. Everything gleamed with careful order, except for deep scratch marks on the prayer bench, partially hidden by a throw blanket. "About your field hand, Elijah?" Pell interrupted. Dr. Tulliver expressed some concerns. "Ah, yes, poor Elijah." Whitfield's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Some souls cannot be saved, Sheriff. Neither by chains nor Christ." He produced the bill of sale from his desk drawer. "Sold to a reputable trader in Natchez, all quite proper." Pell examined the document. The paper was good stock, the seal authentic, though something about the ink troubled him. But without a body, without a single slave willing to speak, what could he prove? "And Mrs. Whitfield?" Pell glanced toward the ceiling. "How does she fare?" "The Lord tests those he loves most dearly." Whitfield refilled their glasses. "Now, about that passage I was explaining." For 2 hours Pell endured the sermon, watching dust motes dance in the sunbeams while Whitfield expounded on divine judgment. When he finally escaped to his horse, the sheriff's neck prickled with unease. He rode past the slave quarters, where doors closed quietly at his approach. A small boy peeking from behind a rain barrel quickly vanished. The following Friday, 10-year-old Tommy Jenkins cast his fishing line in the creek that ran past the Whitfield property. The afternoon heat had driven him to wander closer to the plantation's well, seeking shade beneath the nearby oaks. That's when the smell hit him, something foul and meaty rising from the stone circle. "Pa!" he shouted later at supper. "There's something wrong with the Whitfield well. Smells like when we boiled that dead calf last—" The slap caught him across the mouth before he could finish. "Don't you go spreading tales about God-fearing folk," his father growled. "Not another word about it." Tommy pressed his hand to his stinging cheek, tears welling. Outside, thunder rolled across the darkening sky as June's first storm gathered. Rain began to fall, slow and steady, seeping into the cracked earth around the old well's foundation. September 17th, 1852. The rain had fallen for 3 days straight, turning Lowndes County's red clay into rivers. Sheriff Otis Pell's boots sank ankle-deep in mud as he approached the Whitfield plantation well, where a cluster of field hands stood back from the crumbling stonework. "Found it when the side gave way, Sheriff," said Moses, the eldest of the workers, pointing to where the flood had eaten away the earth. "Thought it was just broken bricks at first, but then we saw the wood." Pell knelt at the well's edge, holding his lantern over the gap. Behind the colonial-era bricks lay a crude wooden frame, its timbers green with age and damp. Rope bindings, though rotted, still held the structure together like a coffin built inside the well's throat. "Get Dr. Tulliver out here," Pell ordered his deputy, "and tell Reverend Whitfield we'll need to dig deeper." By noon, they had recovered the first pieces, a hand-forged iron collar, its lock still intact, attached to lengths of chain that disappeared into the muck. Dr. Tulliver arrived as they pulled up the bones, a man's skeleton, still partially articulated, with the collar's matching chain wrapped around the neck vertebrae. "These aren't old enough," Tulliver muttered, examining a femur. "The iron hasn't had time to fully rust. 2 years, maybe 3 at most." Between the bones they found a rectangular card, its paper gone nearly black with water damage. Tulliver held it carefully to the light, squinting through his wire-rimmed spectacles. "Psalm 22, he said softly. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" The handwriting. I've seen it before, in Elijah's prayer book. Sheriff Pell was examining something that had fallen from between 2 bricks. A man's gold ring, unweathered, with the initials HGS, carved in flowing script. He pocketed it without comment. Reverend Whitfield watched from the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of pious concern. "A tragic discovery," he intoned. "The Lord tests us in mysterious ways." "That he does, Reverend," Pell replied, noting how the preacher's hands trembled slightly. "That he does." They worked until sunset, cataloguing each item as it emerged: scraps of clothing, a broken buckle, fragments of a wooden cup. Dr. Tulliver recorded everything in his leather-bound journal, his usually steady hand growing tighter with each entry. "Sheriff," he said, quietly as they packed up their grim inventory, "there's something else you should see." He produced a folded newspaper from his medical bag, the Montgomery Herald. "I'm placing a notice. Simple description of what we found, asking for anyone who knew Elijah from Georgia or the Sea Islands to come forward." Pell nodded slowly. "Make it discreet, Doctor. We don't want to spook whoever left that ring." The notice ran 3 days later. Tucked between advertisements for cotton gin repairs and a missing cow, information sought regarding former bondsman Elijah, no surname known, originally from Sea Islands of Georgia, sold inland circa 1847, literate, age approx. 24. Any persons having knowledge of same, please contact Sheriff's Office, Lowndes County, area recent discovery, discretion assured. In a small freedmen's mission in Montgomery, a woman named Dinah read the words twice, her hands shaking. Then she took out a sheet of paper and began to write, "I, Dinah Walker, being of sound mind and memory, do hereby swear to the truth of the following events." September 24th, 1852. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the Freedmen's Mission School in Montgomery, casting long shadows across the simple wooden table where Dinah Walker sat, her hands steady as she dipped the pen in ink. Circuit Judge Lemuel Graves adjusted his spectacles, watching intently as she began to write. "State your full name and former place of residence," Judge Graves instructed, his voice gentle but firm. "Dinah Walker, formerly enslaved at the Whitfield plantation in Lowndes County." She spoke clearly, each word measured with precision. The scratch of her pen filled the quiet room. Miss Sarah, the mission school teacher, stood as witness, her face growing paler with each revelation Dinah committed to paper. The affidavit began with dates, times, locations, the careful architecture of truth that Dinah had carried silently for 2 years. "It was after evening prayers when I first heard it," Dinah testified, her writing neat and deliberate. "Reverend Whitfield brought Elijah to the main house. I was cleaning in the hall when I heard the Master's voice from the bedroom, quoting Genesis about the sons of God. Then came sounds no Christian man should make while speaking the Lord's word." Judge Graves leaned forward, his weathered face grave. "You witnessed this directly?" "Yes, sir. Through the crack in the door. The Master made Elijah." Dinah's hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "He forced him to lie with Mrs. Eunice, stood there in the shadows, Bible in hand, talking about racial dominion and divine purpose. Elijah begged to take the whip instead. But the Master said this was God's will." The judge's clerk's pen scratched rapidly across official paper, recording every word. Outside, a church bell tolled the hour, its bronze voice a counterpoint to the heavy silence in the room. "How many times did this occur?" Judge Graves asked. 3 times that I witnessed myself. Always at night, always with scripture. The Master would watch from the corner or the doorway. Sometimes—" Dinah paused, collecting herself. "Sometimes he'd make Elijah recite psalms during the act." The affidavit grew to 4 pages, each detail more damning than the last. Dinah described Elijah's prayers in the stable afterward, his torn shirt bearing Mrs. Eunice's tears, the way he'd scrub himself raw at the wash basin before dawn. When she finished, Judge Graves read the document back slowly, ensuring every word was precise. Dinah listened, head held high, shoulders straight with the weight of truth finally spoken. "And you swear this testimony is accurate under penalty of perjury?" the judge asked formally. "I swear it before God and man," Dinah replied, voice unwavering. The notary's seal pressed into hot wax, making official what had festered in darkness for 2 years. Judge Graves immediately wrote out a warrant for Josiah Whitfield's questioning, the paper still wet when a messenger burst in. "Your Honor," the young man panted, "telegram from Selma. A Methodist preacher there, Reverend Silas Polk, says he recognizes the burial cloth description from the Herald notice. Claims their church vestry was robbed of fine linen in April of 1850. "The timeline matches," the clerk whispered. Judge Graves nodded grimly. "Send word to Selma. Have Reverend Polk bring any church records documenting the theft. We'll need his testimony." October 1st, 1852. Morning light streamed through the stained glass windows of Selma Methodist Church, casting colored shadows across Reverend Silas Polk's weathered hands as he withdrew an aged leather ledger from beneath the pulpit. The brass key rattled in the chest's lock, echoing through the empty sanctuary. "Here," he said, laying the book on a nearby pew. "We keep meticulous records of church property." His finger traced down columns of neat script until he found the entry. April 3rd, 1850. 2 consecrated altar linens missing from vestry storage. Value, $12. Sheriff Pell leaned closer, squinting at the page. "And you're certain about Whitfield's visit that day?" "Thomas," Reverend Polk called to an elderly man straightening hymnals nearby. "Tell the sheriff what you saw that Wednesday." Thomas, the church sexton, shuffled forward. His arthritic hands gripped a wooden cane. "Reverend Whitfield came after morning prayers. Said he needed guidance on a theological matter. I was sweeping near the vestry when he left. Seemed in quite a hurry. Didn't notice the linens were gone until Sunday service." Judge Graves, who had traveled from Montgomery, produced Dinah's affidavit. "These dates align precisely with the timeline of Mrs. Whitfield's pregnancy and the child's burial." Reverend Polk nodded grimly. Whitfield's sermons had grown disturbing. He'd visit our Wednesday services, stand up during testimony to rant about racial purification through divine intervention. Spoke of breeding experiments in the Old Testament, claimed God demanded new forms of sacrifice. The Reverend's face tightened with disgust. "Did he ever mention Elijah specifically?" Sheriff Pell asked. "Not by name, but he referred often to a chosen vessel among his slaves. Said this man would help prove some twisted theory about hereditary salvation." Polk pulled another book from the chest, a visitor's registry. "Here, his signatures grow more erratic over these months. The last one, just before the child's death, is barely legible." Judge Graves examined the signatures. "Matches the deteriorating handwriting in his plantation ledgers. Signs of increasing mental instability." A young deputy burst through the church doors. "Sheriff, we found him. He's conducting a river baptism 3 miles south." Within an hour, the lawmen surrounded the muddy bank where Whitfield stood waist-deep in water, gripping a terrified young slave woman by the shoulders. His once fine coat was soaked and filthy, his eyes wild as he shouted scripture. "Josiah Whitfield," Sheriff Pell called out, "step out of the water. You're under arrest for the murder of Elijah and conspiracy in acts of forced violation." Whitfield's laugh echoed across the river. "Murder? I cleansed him. through the sacred union, through the divine—" He never finished. 2 deputies waded in, dragging him splashing and raving to shore. As they shackled his wrists, water dripping from his sleeves, he began quoting Leviticus in a sing-song voice. "Get him to Wetumpka," Judge Graves ordered. "Maximum security holding until trial." They loaded Whitfield into an iron-barred wagon. As it rolled away, Reverend Polk made the sign of the cross. "Lord, have mercy on his soul." "The Lord's mercy may wait," Sheriff Pell replied grimly. "First comes earthly justice." He turned to mount his horse, then paused as Clem, who had followed them from the plantation, stepped forward. "Sheriff," the field hand said quietly, "there's another well needs checking. Back of the theology barn. Elijah weren't the only one taken there for private prayer." October 3rd, 1852. Dawn broke cold and grey over the Whitfield estate. Sheriff Pell's boots crunched across frost-covered grass as he led Dinah and Marcus Webb, the county surveyor, toward the theology barn. The structure loomed against the pale sky, its weathered boards the color of old bones. "There," Dinah pointed to a circular stone cap partially hidden by tall weeds. "Behind where he'd do his preaching." Webb consulted his brass instruments, while 2 deputies worked the iron pump. Brackish water gushed onto the ground, carrying a smell that made the men step back. Hours passed, as the well slowly drained, the sun climbing higher, but offering little warmth. By mid-morning, Webb descended on a rope ladder, lantern swaying. "Got something," he called up. "Looks like bones, animal mostly, and cloth." Sheriff Pell watched as deputies hauled up the evidence in woven baskets. Charred fabric, splintered bones, rusted farm tools. Webb emerged last, clutching something wrapped in oilcloth. "Found this wedged between stones," he said, carefully unfolding the package. Inside was a single ledger page, carefully folded and sealed in beeswax, stamped with Whitfield's distinctive cross and crown seal. Dinah's hands trembled as she recognized the handwriting. "That's from his private book, the one he'd write in after the barn meetings." Pell squinted at the faded ink. Columns of names filled the page, each with dates and cryptic notations. Marcus, brought to barn May 12th. Failed Sarah, brought to barn June 3rd. Failed, burned Thomas, brought to barn July 17th. Failed these names, Dinah whispered, all ones he claimed were sold away. A woman's voice drifted across the cotton field, singing a slow, eerie lullaby. They turned to see Eunice, Whitfield wandering between the rows, her bare feet leaving prints in the morning dew. Her grey dress was soiled at the hem, her golden hair loose and tangled with leaves. "Sleep, my child. Sleep, my dear," she sang softly, swaying as she walked. "Angel wings will bring you near." Deputies exchanged uncomfortable glances. Dinah watched her former mistress with a mix of pity and revulsion. "She's been like that since—" she paused. "Since the baby." Sheriff Pell carefully wrapped the ledger page and tucked it into his coat. "Get Mrs. Whitfield inside," he ordered a deputy, "and send for Dr. Tulliver. She'll need laudanum before we can question her." That evening, in the Montgomery courthouse, Judge Graves held the recovered page to a candle, studying the bleeding ink. His magnifying glass moved slowly across the entries until it stopped at one particular line. Elijah, brought to barn, recurring, offspring achieved. The judge's hand shook slightly as he set down the glass. Across the room, Sheriff Pell stood with his hat in his hands, waiting. "Schedule the final deposition," Graves said finally, "and ensure Mrs. Whitfield is coherent when she takes the stand. We need her testimony, sober testimony, to confirm what this page suggests." "Yes, Your Honor." Pell paused at the door. "And the well?" "Seal it," Graves ordered. But document everything first. Every bone, every scrap. Whatever demons Whitfield conjured in that barn, we'll drag them into the light of day. October 10th, 1852. Morning sunlight filtered through the high windows of the Montgomery Circuit Court, casting prison bar shadows across Eunice Whitfield's wan face. She perched at the edge of the witness chair like a sparrow ready to flee, her black mourning dress hanging loose on her diminished frame. Judge Graves leaned forward, his silver spectacles catching the light. "Mrs. Whitfield," the prosecutor began gently, "please tell the court what occurred in your home beginning January of 1850. Eunice's fingers worked at a handkerchief, already damp with tears. "Josiah said it was God's will, that we'd been barren because we hadn't," her voice cracked, "hadn't followed the true path." The packed courtroom held its breath. In the gallery, Dr. Tulliver gripped his medical bag, ready with smelling salts if needed. Dinah sat rigid in the colored section, her eyes never leaving her former mistress. "He would make me lie still," Eunice continued, barely above a whisper. "In the evening, after prayers, he'd bring Elijah from the barn. Poor Elijah." Fresh tears spilled. Josiah would stand in the shadows, reading from Leviticus, about seed and heritage and... She pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. Judge Graves nodded to the bailiff, who brought her water. After several sips, Eunice straightened her shoulders. "Elijah begged him. Said he'd take any punishment instead. But Josiah just read louder, about Abraham and Hagar, about vessels of clay. When I became with child, Josiah said it proved his divine instruction was correct." The prosecutor approached with a leather-bound Bible. "Is this the book your husband read from?" Eunice recoiled. "Yes. He'd marked certain passages about mixing vessels. And after the child was born, it came too early. So dark, so still." Her voice hollowed. "Josiah wrapped it in stolen church linen and buried it himself. 2 nights later I heard..." She swayed slightly. "I heard sounds from the well, like someone trying to scream through water." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Several women dabbed their eyes. Judge Graves called a brief recess while Eunice composed herself. When the session resumed, the verdict came swiftly. Josiah Whitfield, already in custody, stood stone-faced as the clerk read the charges. Coercion, murder, religious perversion. Judge Graves sentenced him to life in Wetumpka prison. "May God have mercy on your soul," the judge intoned. "God's mercy flows through strange vessels," Whitfield responded, eyes fever-bright. They led him away in chains. The clerk recorded the final notation in precise script. "People versus J. Whitfield, file number 392. Ledger missing 1 page." He paused, quill hovering, then added, "Case closed per judicial order." But the ring marked HGS, found with Elijah's remains, was never claimed. No local man acknowledged ownership. The evidence box containing it gathered dust in the courthouse basement, while whispers persisted that another hand had turned the barn key on those dark nights of twisted scripture. A year later, word reached Montgomery that Josiah Whitfield had died of prison fever, still quoting Leviticus. Elijah's bones remained in the courthouse evidence room, unclaimed and unburied, their final rest as uncertain as the full truth of what happened in that theology barn.